All right, and we're going to get going. Okay, welcome everyone to the scenario planning meeting for the Statewide Transportation Advisory Committee meeting. Okay, this is your third meeting as a group. You've had a couple of joint meetings, but this is your third meeting. What we're going to do today, we're going to do some quick introductions. We're not going to introduce everyone on the phone. We don't have the time for that. Introductions and reminders. What is the LRTP? We're going to give you a brief project update. We're going to go, this is the fun part of the plan. Like Wendy was just saying, this is our time to like be visionary, to think about what the future can hold for Alaska and how the state of Alaska can develop amazing policies to address those future scenarios, right? So this is the fun part. And Lorna is going to give you an introduction to scenario planning. And she's going to talk about the technical advisory committee that the team worked with in order to do that. Then we're going to talk about these potential 3 plausible futures, okay? And then we're going to talk about where we're going to go next. I'm Holly Spoth Torres. I'm going to be your guide today. There's just a couple of ground rules I want to remind you of today. 1, be visionary. 2, we're going to call on a lot of you, so don't think that you can just like lurk in the background here on the teams. Again, if I call on you and you don't have an answer, just say so. That's fine, right? This isn't supposed to be pressure. I just want to make sure everyone is participating. 3rd, there's a lot of us. When you do have something to say, please be concise and give other people some time to participate too. So if somebody is dominating, I might move us along. Or if somebody gets off topic, I might move us along. So please don't be offended. Just know I'm trying to get everyone to participate. Okay. What is the Long Range Transportation Plan and Freight Plan? As you all know, this is the policy plan that guides our decisions, DOT, state-owned facilities, and it guides their policies and decisions over the next 25 years. It's required by both federal regulation and state statute, okay? The Long Range Transportation Plan, it's a policy plan, so it drives our goals, policies, investment strategies in a measurable way. That's also required, that it's measurable, so that we can have an adaptive and resilient transportation system into the future. Again, it's a high-level policy plan. It does not identify specific projects, okay? However, there's a freight plan element to this long-range transportation plan. The freight plan is a guide to maintain and improve Alaska's freight transportation system in order to strengthen our economy, raise the quality of life, and make sure that goods move about the state. The freight plan is different because the freight plan does identify specific projects, okay? So that's the difference between the 2 different elements. The last time we did this plan was in 2016. The freight plan was in 2017. So that gives you an idea of the time frame. Okay.
Just to get really excited, new federal regulations are going to require these to be updated every 4 years. So just when we finish up, you can start over.
Brian Funkhauser from Michael Baker, he called it the Golden Gate Bridge painting scenario. Once you're done, you just start again. Okay. So, update to the project. Okay. So, again, you know, this is the 3rd time you've been meeting. The project has been developing through a series of technical memoranda, meetings with this statewide transportation advisory committee, the freight advisory committee, a boatload of stakeholder interviews, public outreach events. We've already had 1. There will be 2 more in the future, 1 coming up here really quickly. And so all of these will culminate into the final documents that will be the Long Range Transportation Plan. So those 5 memoranda were the transportation assessment. So when we were doing data analysis, that's when we met with you the first time. There's the freight memo, there's a financial analysis memo, there's a goals and driving factors memo that was just recently completed. And then the next one to be completed will be the scenario planning technical memorandum, okay? after we finish the scenario planning phase, we'll move into actually developing the plan and sharing that. Okay, now for the fun part. We're going to pass it off to Lorna to start talking about scenario planning. And when you're ready to advance the slide, Lorna, just let me know and I'll do that.
Will do. Thank you. All right. So for the long range transportation plan, the LRTP and freight plan, exploratory scenario planning is going to be used to look at alternative possible futures. So in other words, we know we can't really predict the future that far out with so many different things happening. You can see the images are kind of evoking some of the technology-oriented changes, for example. So what we want to do is focus on how to be prepared. So scenario planning is going to inform the planning process. It's going to inform the policy plan, help us think about risks and opportunities, but it doesn't really dictate that strategic course of action. It's going to help us identify certain tactics, policies, investments, even things like data that we need to develop that will help us be prepared for a system that's more resilient to a wide variety of uncertain but very possible or plausible future conditions. So for example, we're thinking about what kinds of transportation systems will be needed in each scenario. If the future turns out this way, do we need more of certain kinds of infrastructure and less of others? What new investment strategies or policies might be needed? How will transportation revenue be impacted if things, go a certain way? And also, how might DOT and PF structure, business processes, and capabilities change? You'll see that workforce is an issue that comes up again and again in our discussions around the future and scenarios, and so that's an example of an area that we're really going to pay attention to as we go through and think about how to be prepared for the future. You can go to the next slide. So what we're trying to do here is acknowledge that what may happen to Alaska with respect to certain driving forces is unknown, but by thinking through what could happen, we'll be better prepared to manage risk and maximize opportunities. That's really our guiding principle for scenario planning. What could happen? We want to stay in the realm of the plausible, but what we're doing is really focusing on how to be prepared for an uncertain future. You can go to the next slide. So to help us in that effort, we have a technical advisory committee for the scenario planning, and they have a very active advisory role, and they were carefully crafted to bring a statewide perspective. So we have folks on that committee from all of these different areas. So I want to give you a second to read that, and then we'll go on to the next slide.
So just quickly, we're meeting with the technical advisory committee about 4 times, and they're kind of a bouncing off, just another group to make sure we're on track and help just ground truth our plausible scenarios.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, they've been a real important partner in the effort. Okay, so as you know, the plan has a number of driving factors, but we've really honed in on these 3 to help inform those plausible futures. So we're asking questions about what could happen, and it's really kind of come to the forefront of those discussions that one of the most useful ways of framing that up is really looking at what could happen to the economy. So you'll see that's really kind of an organizing principle for the scenarios. At the same time, we want to look at different funding scenarios and think about whether economic growth and those possible futures will align with the assumptions we make about potential future funding from the feds and others. And then with that, as I mentioned, there's a real focus on workforce. So we'll be thinking about how the workforce needs and issues and their transportation needs relate to these alternate futures. And I just want you to keep in mind as we start talking about the scenarios that this isn't an exercise in which we're going to say, all right, here's 3 alternate futures, let's pick the one we like or pick the one we think will happen. We want to learn from all of them. I think, in the past when I've talked about scenario planning and talked about disruptors, people kind of, not everyone is comfortable with that notion, but now that we've been through the pandemic, I think everybody can relate to what we mean by a disruptor. Okay, so we've all been living through an experience for the last 2 years of extreme disruption, and scenario planning is about thinking through on a long-term basis, how might the way that we work and travel and how our economy might function, how might that be different? And what do we need to do to be prepared to adapt? So let's go on and let's talk about the scenarios that we're laying out. So we've come up with 3 scenarios, 3 plausible futures, and we very intentionally put pictures of children in the icons here because this is 2045. We're planning the transportation system of the future and for our children. And so it's really important to think about that long time frame and try to make sure that we don't get too caught up in short range thinking. So those images of children will help us with that. So the 3 scenarios are full speed ahead. And in full speed ahead, we're talking about very robust economic growth. Then we have cruising. Cruising is kind of moving forward along the current trajectory, which is modest growth for the future. And then powering down is an even more negative scenario, particularly from an economic perspective, in which the economy is not growing and it's continuing to shrink in some parts of the state. So those are the overall organizing themes of our 3 scenarios. And then within each one, we're thinking about, those other driving forces. What happens with funding? What happens with workforce? We're also layering in some thoughts about resiliency and technology in each of them as well. You can go to the next slide. What we also do in the scenario planning is we really try to link land use and transportation. And the way that we do that is what we call a tool we call place types. So, just to be clear, so we're not doing like a very sophisticated modeling process for these scenarios because this is a policy plan and we're getting this done within our schedule and budget constraints. This is really kind of a policy-oriented, what I would call a sketch planning approach. So we're using GIS tools, we're using data, but we're not doing like a complex modeling approach. And but what we can do in GIS is use place types to help us link transportation needs to the different geographies of the state of Alaska. So we've developed place types, as you see on this slide, including urban, rural, isolated urban rural, remote, and then isolated remote. And these kind of fall on a spectrum, and each of them has different characteristics related to the kinds of transportation that people would use. And we're particularly focusing in on differences between kind of highway versus aviation versus marine highway as some of the core means of transportation in each of these areas. And we'll layer in other modal insights qualitatively. But with that, I'd like Wendy to give you kind of a little bit more of the landscape of the place types with some examples.
Yeah, so in order to understand the place types, everyone needs to forget a little bit about what you know about land use and how we categorize our communities. So when we say urban, we're really saying it has all modes of transportation. So we're really doing this by access because connectivity has been such an important theme, and so has equity. And so we really wanted to think about each place in Alaska in terms of that connectedness. So by rural, we don't necessarily mean the community is extremely rural. So in rural, we're actually considering places like Willow, Tok, Valdez, Homer, because they're connected to a road. They have air, they have ferry, and they potentially have train. Then when we get to isolated urban rural, which is this is where you have to bear with me, Juneau's in this category, right? It is isolated because some days you can't get there by air, some days you can't get there by ferry, and there is no road. So again, really looking at those place types. So for isolated urban rural, you have Juneau, Haines, Unalaska, Kodiak. So again, we have more limited types of access. Remote is really, you can get in there by air or water, and primarily air. And then isolated remote would be more than 30 miles from a primary mode. So places like isolated remote, we have Arctic Village, Pelican, and actually, you know, in the days of COVID, you could almost put Skagway and Haines in there because they can't get through Canada. So they're isolated remote. So again, as we look at all this data, we want to understand how these different scenarios, our powering down, our cruising, and our full speed ahead might change the connectivity and might change the number of modes that are in there for the positive or for the negative. So really kind of tying it all back to there. So when you hear place types, don't think land use, think access. So we have categorized each community in Alaska by this and to understand kind of investment and how the different scenarios will impact these. Any questions on place types while we're kind of on this slide? And then I saw Nils had a thought that we're probably not cruising right now, that status quo is actually powering down. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? Plausible future number 4 is plodding and stumbling ahead.
Okay, so
hold on. So does anyone else have any thoughts? Just if we kind of go back to full speed ahead, cruising and powering down, do other people feel like powering down is more of our status quo right now? The decline?
Okay. Well, we're going to go through one exercise next, unless you want to, you came off, you turned on your camera, Nils. Do you want to say something?
Just, I mean, just to explain it a little bit, and I saw it, we're not in total decline, but I mean, I think if we look back at economic and population, state budget, you know, all the different GDP trends over the last 7 years, we're not stable. So if cruising means status quo, then status quo is kind of this gentle decline. Powering down might be a more substantial decline, it maybe is what you're thinking, but that's just where I think we're at right now. And maybe we're headed with infrastructure funds and federal relief, and we definitely see recovery and bouncing back from some of that. But we'll see where it goes. This is fine too. I'm not arguing necessarily with the framing.
Yeah, and when I did cruising, for me too, Nils, it was a little bit of kind of up and down, and it kind of stumbling and plodding ahead is a good one, but yeah, I'm not sure what we call turbulent, maybe?
Surfing.
Surfing.
I don't know.
Yeah, but we do recognize our status quo is a bit up and down as Alaska has been. And then Ryan asked, do we have a document of all the towns? You will see that it's not quite in a legible format just yet, but yes, we do have all of that mapped and we will be transparent with that. So we can send that out shortly after this meeting.
All right. So though there will be opportunity to talk through these scenarios a little bit more later in the meeting, but before we do, we're going to get into a discussion about this map. Wendy, do you want to give a precursor to this, or do you want me to talk about the plausible future map? Did you have? I'll dive in first. So we've been doing this. Sorry, I don't know. Here I am. Okay, so we've been using this graphic with many of the groups we've been talking to, including the TAC. So this is a work in progress, and we want this group to go through this map exercise as well. So from a plausible future standpoint, thinking to the future, think about Alaska transportation, think about projects that you know that are in development. So major activities that could change the transportation network. What is missing from this map right now? which projects are most likely to happen. And if there's something on the horizon that you're thinking about, maybe start thinking through how you think they might transform transportation needs into the future. How is our transportation system and investment priorities going to need to change in order to address the project that's may or may not advance? So the first, I'm going to call on Adam Moser first. I know that you have something you want to participate with. So why don't we go to Adam first?
Well, thank you all. And less that I wanted to participate, but we met with Wendy earlier in the team this morning, and I had a comment that they asked me to share with the group to get the discussion going here. And for everybody else in the group, this is my first meeting with the STAC. I'm Adam Moser, currently deputy director, under Director James Marks for Division of Program Development and Statewide Planning at AKDOT. James, our director, is at a Transportation Research Board meeting in DC at the moment, so is not able to be with us today. My comment this morning that I'll try to surmise again here was that I saw a basic tension for me in this presentation. We started off with the new technologies, new disruptors, and so forth, getting to this slide of a possible future with a lot of projects on here, whether it be roads to Nome, et cetera, Connect Arm, that have been in discussion in the state for 30 to 20 years. So we were looking in, and to me, the tension would be, if we're looking to the future in different scenarios, are we looking at disruptors? Are we trying to do projects that have been talked about and discussed for decades as well? So that's just kind of and can we do both? But of course, we're always dealing with limited resources for all of these projects. And my background with the Department of Transportation is coming from the federal funding side of things. So I'm fairly familiar with our restrictions on all of the federal funding that we have coming in and the funds that we do have to pursue a lot of these ideas and projects in the state as well. So are we looking for disruptors and how they might change what we thought we needed 20, 30 years ago to make the state economically viable and vibrant? Are we looking at the same projects for the same reasons for our children, as we discussed earlier? Are those projects going to serve them well? So that's just kind of what I saw, and is where we might want to take the discussion and where we could have a productive conversation, I think.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam. I guess before I start going around, Wendy, do you have anything you want to add? Or do you want
Are these projects disruptors?
Yeah.
Will these projects change the transportation system? Can technology replace, enhance, or otherwise, I guess, change the face of Alaska? Is Red Dog Mine running out of ore? What's it mean? Oh, I'm gonna have to call on Kim.
So unfair.
I'm sure you have ideas.
I guess the only thing I keep thinking is that, yeah, when I see the West Susitna Access Road on this map as a, having implications on transportation infrastructure and planning, I just see it as a road that's going to take money away from all the projects people need. So it's hard for me to, I don't know what the benefit of that road is other than to Estelle Gold Mine and these other industries. I don't see how it's helping Mat-Su residents or Alaskans. And similarly for Kinnicon Bridge, when we look at our build out scenario for the borough, there's only enough developable land out there to create house sites for about 20,000 people. So we're going to spend $2 billion on a bridge for 20,000 people. But are there other plans for the bridge? Anyway, so that's my initial thought. I don't understand how these green lines on a map for roads to resources what does it? And I don't understand the state budget enough to know how those developments fund state budget other than the North Slope. How does that help me help people get to where they're going to work or to school? Or anyway, that's all I'll say.
That was perfect.
Oh,
That was
Thanks.
perfect. That's exactly the kind of discussion we're looking for, because as a consultant team, we can go back and do all of this, and you all are going to question, where did you get these ideas? We need them out there. We need to be talking about these. Does it bring jobs? Does it bring population?
Maybe.
I'll chime in one more time. There, specifically, I guess, Wendy, did you have a specific project or something? You say, does it bring jobs or population?
So these aren't projects. These aren't projects we're recommending in the plan. These are projects that the technical advisory committee, that the freight advisory committee, that even this group has brought up that could change how DOT has to provide transportation services. They could increase, if the Ambler mine goes through, for example, it could increase demand on the transportation system. Can the existing roadway network carry that extra freight? So we're not recommending that these are projects. We're saying these projects could influence the number of people coming to Alaska, the jobs, the demand on the infrastructure, or the lack of demand. If Red Dog Mine closes, do we need to close an airport? If the West Susitna, I mean, does that suddenly bring a population out to that area and we need to get people back and forth more?
If all cars sold in America by 2030 are electric, what does that mean for the state of Alaska and economic growth, right? And I think that those are the type of scenarios that we would be thinking about, but those are certain things that are outside of our control to some extent as a state. But certainly the electrification of the transportation sector would be something, and that's something that Senator Murkowski's office has been working significantly on, is trying to encourage the mining of those minerals and so forth for the electrification of transportation as well. But
exactly,
are the type of scenarios that we're wanting to discuss here.
Yep.
Okay, we have some hands up. I'm going to start going to the participant list. We're going to go to you first, Gordon. I know you signed on very late. There's a lot of people on today. If you just could keep your comments very brief and to the point of the plausible future, that would be helpful. And then we'll get to the other 4 people that have their hands up. Go ahead, Gordon.
All right, I'm connected by teleconference and not through the Teams thing. So can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, very interesting, and I just wanted to mention that the North Slope Borough, working with DNR and to some degree with the DOT, have been planning in the Arctic, called the A-STAR project, the Arctic Strategic Transportation and Resources study. And that study has come to a milestone to where we are now entertaining with BLM and the Corps of Engineers pre-application for a possible application for a portion of that study to be subject to review. And we call it the Tri-Village Implementation Area between Barrow, Wainwright, and Utkasuk, knowing all the well that the industry is now poised to move 30 miles west of Nuiqsut on into federal public lands for the Willow Project, that these infrastructures have been in planning stage for about 3 or 4 years. And I just wanted to mention that some of the issues around some of that is connectivity between communities, energy movement, and just the cost of doing anything in the Arctic, including resource development, are all huddled together in that handbasket to try to effectuate that. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you,
If there
Gordon.
was something missing on the, if there was something missing on the map, I would say it would be the A-star study on the Arctic area.
Thanks, Gordon. Great. Okay, we'll go to Robert next. Go ahead. Go ahead, Robert. You might be on mute. Okay, keep working on your audio. We're going to go to the next person. I'll come back to you. Go ahead, Nils.
Yeah, I just would, I don't know that projects determine our future. I don't know that any of these are transformational. You know, they require adaptation, there's increased demand, there's new routes, but they're not changing the overall system at all. I guess I would just add that in terms of what's missing, yep, there's a couple projects on here. There's plenty of, I mean, if I think of the $2 billion federal investment in water and sewer, like that's a pretty big investment that's going to be transformational. If I think about the $2 billion in port and harbor needs that are project needs right now that are out there, that would be transformational. So I think electrification, somebody mentioned, that would be transformational. But I don't know that projects are transformational. Projects, you know, that's kind of the up and down, right? But they're not going to change dramatically the overall system approach that's necessary for a future.
So Nils, how does water and sewer as a transformational change influence how we plan for transportation?
I'm not saying that it necessarily is, but it's a system change that, like, when I'm thinking about transformational of a system, it's a huge investment that actually does change dramatically how a future looks, right? So when we're thinking about a future for transportation, if we're saying, you know, here's a $5 billion investment into the system, that could be transformational. And what would that look like is different than a project by project approach that's fairly incremental in how we think about that same future.
Robert, did you get it figured out? No, you didn't. Okay, keep working on it. You might need to unplug. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yes, hello. I have a question. Hopefully it's not going to be too disruptive to the conversation, but has any thought been put into the fiscal constraints of this plan? Because you put a lot of projects on a map and then you want to know if they're actually affordable or not. As Kim kind of mentioned, the Kinnickarn Bridge is a lot of money.
Hold on, Aaron, I'm going to stop you. I'm going to interrupt here just real quick and then let you finish. We are not recommending these projects in this plan by any stretch of the imagination. These are projects Alaskans have talked about, and that could change how we need to provide transportation. And I kind of want to go back to Red Dog Mine. There was just an article that it may run out of minerals in 10 years. Does that change our transportation system? Does the Ambler mine change how we provide transportation? So please don't think that we are recommending these projects, not at all. But they could influence if they happened outside of Alaska DOT, they could influence population and economy.
Well, I mean, I guess my thing still stands. If you guys are going to be showing projects in any way, shape, or form, are you going to be including a fiscal analysis? Because if you are showing projects that impact our area, the Anchorage area, the MPO area, it puts us in a situation to where we have to show how it is going to be paid for. So that would be my recommendation, is that, you know, if you're going to be showing projects, have some kind of fiscal analysis that talks about it. If you're not going to be showing projects, then the whole discussion kind of shifts as to, you know, it makes it harder to have this discussion if you don't actually talk about these future projects.
This map was generated for scenario planning to understand what could happen across the state. This is not a map that we would include in the plan or share with the public. It's merely to spark discussion about what the future of Alaska could look like in 50 years from a variety of just investment projects.
But I mean, that relates to what I was, if you don't have the money to pay for these projects, then they're not going to necessarily impact our future. And so you know,
Got it.
fiscal assumptions go hand in hand with this discussion.
Absolutely agree. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Steve.
Okay, thanks. I'm kind of struggling a little bit with what my relevance to the whole conversation is, quite frankly. Because if it's a long-range transportation plan focusing on policy-related guidance for state-owned facilities, then ports should not be on this map at all because the state doesn't own any. Ferry terminals they own, ports they don't. And I'm trying to get my head around what port-related policy decisions the state's going to make, or even is interested in making, that's going to affect what's going on in the port side of things statewide. I mean, our modernization program isn't even a little circle on this, green or otherwise, but the Nome Deepwater Port is. What's that all about? I'm having a hard time, just trying to decide when anything I have to say is going to matter, or what.
So I think part of it is that if there is a deep water port in the Nome area, like in 50 years, how would that change how we move freight throughout the state? Or how would that change the operations of the Port of Alaska? Or, I mean, it's just kind of like trying to future think. What would happen if?
Well, I don't know if you want to have that conversation now. I can give you,
I can
give you my 50,000 foot view.
Yeah, that's
what we want to happen. We want to get you fired up, and we want to hear what you have to say, Steve.
Well, so how big is the state population going to be in 50 years? How much bigger than it is now? Is it realistically really going to be? What's the next big, Trans-Alaska Pipeline project that's going to cause in-migration? That's going to increase the size of the state population, because if that ain't changing by much, then the transportation system we've got now, as long as it's not falling apart, is sufficient for what we're going to need in 50 years. The road infrastructure could very likely be as sufficient now as it would be in 50 years. I appreciate all of the resource development related infrastructure changes. That makes a heck of a lot of sense. And there are aspects of even the shipping of resources that would need to be rediscussed. If there is an Alaska to Alberta rail line that comes into the state, and the state owns no ports, I can tell you the railroad is going to rely on the ports as part of whatever supply chain enhancements it thinks Alaska is going to have when there's a railroad that connects us to the outside. And the same conversations with the international airport now. It says it right there on a little map: air to sea service. Yet the sea part of that doesn't even have a little circle on the map, because the sea part of that is us. There's no place else they can bring that stuff that can get it to the markets they're theorizing there's going to be an interest in getting them to faster, but for sending it out through this port. So there's, this is what gets me, gets me scratching my head.
Okay.
It's enough said.
No, it's good. I might ask a follow-up to you or for everyone, but I want to go to Jackson first. You did have your hand up, you put it down, but I want to check in and see if you have something you want to add. And then I'll go to the chat and then I'll ask a follow-up.
Yeah, I do. I'll be real brief. And I'm going to start with a question. So the question is that when we're looking at this long-range plan, we're thinking about a 20-year planning horizon. Is that correct? Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to say something super pessimistic right now, then I'm going to say something optimistic. So the first thing I want to say is that, a lot of these resource development projects and whatnot that we see on this map here have been talked about for a long time. I mean, look at the Alaska liquid natural gas line. We've been talking about that since the late 70s, 80s. Pebble Mine, I used to hunt caribou in the late 80s and early 90s out on that site on Groundhog Mountain, and they were staking it at that time. They were surveying and staking it for mine development. So, you know, you look at a lot of these big pie in the sky projects, and they've already been talked about for 30 or 40 years. And I'm not sure they're good assumptions for this plan that they are actually going to come to fruition in the next 20. I think that we've spun our wheels on them for a long time, and I think we're going to continue to spin our wheels for them over the next 20 years. So that's my pessimistic statement there, that I don't know that these are good assumptions for the scenario planning. They're good to have in mind, but I don't have confidence that they're actually going to come to fruition in the next 20 years. But what I will say is that I do believe that there will be military expansion. I think the railway to Canada is a possibility. But what we're also seeing here in Fairbanks, that there's existing mines that, you know, that they've kind of termed out of, you know, they've dug out everything that they could dig out, but then new company comes in and says, nope, there's more. And starting this coming summer, we're going to have trucks coming right through our urban area, 384 round trips per day, trucks coming up from Delta up to Fort Knox and going right through our community. So we are going to experience in the coming years a tremendous amount of more freight through our area, but also what we experienced with the recent expansion at the Eielson Air Force Base. Just a couple of days ago, they announced that we're the fastest growing borough in the state. We even beat Matsu this year, and that's because of the military expansion. So on our local transportation networks in the Fairbanks North Pole areas, we are already experiencing increased pressure on the roadways with vehicles and heavy trucks, but also a lot more new residents to our area that need bike and ped facilities where a lot of new homes are going up, and not all the infrastructure is there. So on the optimistic side, I do think military expansion, continued mine development of existing mines is plausible, and potentially the railway into Canada. And we are experiencing those impacts, you know, as we speak. And within the next 20 years, I expect to you know, that to continue and increase. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to go to the chat for just 1 second. Oh, yeah, there's a lot going on in the chat that I was listening to the people. Okay. Oh, is there anywhere you want me to go in the chat? So this is where I was headed with a follow-up to Steve, because I think that Nils brought up something that is also potentially climate related. So Steve, I'm on board with what you said. If our population projections are decreasing, then what the infrastructure we have right now is probably fine to serve the state. However, I'm wondering if, as an ice-free Arctic continues to happen, how Alaska is positioned globally from a port facility. Nils was like, I think that was related to fish and the coastal infrastructure that exists when fish move based on natural phenomenon or habitat or climate. So those are some of the other things that aren't necessarily Alaska focused, but how Alaska responds to things that are happening globally. And so I guess if we switch our mind a little bit like that, does anybody have any input about that? And then if anybody put anything in the chat that you want to expand on, I'm happy to go there. There's a lot there. I can't follow all of it right now.
First of all, I just want to say this is exactly the kind of conversation we hoped this would spur. So I, as a planner for this, am super excited about the conversations. You're giving us invaluable input to come up with plausible futures, and this dialogue is perfect. So thank you. Steve?
Yeah. I'm trying to get a picture in my head of the completely and forever thawed out Nome, Alaska. And there being a port there, and what that would do to commerce with respect to the state. And you know, I got to come back to, nobody ships anything to a port. You ship it to an end user through a port. So what a port needs so that the delivery of these goods to people isn't an astronomical cost, given that where we live on the planet makes things more expensive whether we like it or not, is you got to have connectivity to other transportation systems, whether there's road, rail, or pipeline, or other shipping lanes. If you don't have some combination of those or all of those, then you're not a viable entity in commerce, because you're never going to do it cheap enough for anybody to say it pencils out to come to you. And that's going to be the Alaska problem forever. And there's not that many places that have the infrastructure. And even if you have the infrastructure, the thing that everybody tends to forget about is the skilled workforce that's going to turn this thing into something that's going to matter. So you are limited in a state with less than 1 million people to find more than one place that can do that. Whether anybody wants to hear that or not, that's the reality of it.
Okay.
So if there's a port that can take a barge or two that can support the population in the local area, have at it. Because that's how it is in Ketchikan, that's how it is in Juneau, that's how it is in Cordova and Homer and Seward and on and on and on. But there's only a couple of places that have connectivity to the state's transportation system as it exists today, with no real justification for making it any bigger, that are going to matter supply chain wise as we fit into the global marketplace.
Okay.
And that's kind of that's my assessment of this.
Thanks, Steve. So before I get to you, Nils, I just want to bring up Robert. Robert was having audio difficulties. And maybe Wendy, you can help me with this. Robert's talking about a plausible future depicted on the map for southeastern coastal Alaska. Maybe a major reform of the Alaska Marine Highway system and marine transportation. So I guess there's a few projects listed. And anything else to add for the South Coast or Southeast?
So again, I think we're not necessarily looking at a ferry project. Some of these are road projects, some of these are resource projects. Some of it's the international airport and the immense cargo work that they're doing, which ties back to the port. So again, these are things that might happen in Alaska and how they influence transportation. So in terms of ferry, this is where I think maybe technology comes in. Does an electric ferry reduce the cost? Can they provide more? Are there other ways to get around? So in Southeast, something that may be transformative is technology. For the Port of Anchorage, it could be also some technology there. So again, what's going to change how transportation is provided in the Southeast? And so what does it look like in 2050? Do we have hyperloops? I showed that picture earlier to DOT leadership and they laughed at me. But do we have hyperloops? Do we have personal airplanes? Those are starting to come up where we're flying back and forth. So this is a time to imagine a little bit, a time to be a little bit disruptive. Maybe it's unrealistic. What we've heard strongly is a lot of these projects probably aren't going to radically transform Alaska. That's what the planning team needs to hear. That's what we need to carry forward in this plan for the message.
Okay, we'll go to Nils, then we'll go to Lee, and then we'll start wrapping it up and moving on to the next discussion. Go ahead, Nils.
Yeah, thanks. And I was going to amplify or articulate what Robert was talking about, and I think you just touched on it. So I do, though, think it comes back to what Steve just said. I really like this, that it's not the infrastructure that's going to change the future. It's the economic activity that's going to change the future. So projects are really, if they're on here, should be related to that economic activity and not the infrastructure that's responding to that economic activity. Or at least, Steve, that was my takeaway from what you said. I like that. And I think that does lead into, a conversation about the ferry system, coastal transportation needs. When I think of economic activity related to those, it's independent travelers, it's larger, if there's economic fisheries, tourism, population growth, and then there'll be greater demands on that kind of system. if there's an inflow of federal investment into the system, maybe that drives some of that economic activity. So it'd be great to see it reflected somehow. And the other piece of that, and when I started thinking about independent travelers, the long trail, I know that's not an economic project, but it goes back to independent travelers and tourism. And this economy of the future might not be a mining project. It might be travel and tourism for millions and millions of global visitors.
Okay, thanks. Lee, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think Nils always speaks better English than I do, so he summed up a lot of what I was going to say. A couple things I just wanted to highlight, though. It's a moot point, sort of, but it becomes a point. The location of the Ambler mine on the map is a bit deceiving. It's about 80 miles further to the west, which kind of plays into a road length, right? The impact of that road, which my second comment gets into the Yukon corridor. And you talk Ambler Road project, Yukon Corridor Road project, both are kind of a top-down approach to a highway or a defined trail. To me, when I look at that, it's sort of missing the statewide conversation, is missing the 50th anniversary of ANCSA concepts of ownership, inclusion, and communication, right? And it's sort of, those two are losing propositions as a road, just to be relatively blunt. Where you have potential winning propositions is a rail system with less impact. And it's just, that's something to note that, at high levels, we're missing that a lot, I feel like. Ports, I think, are important. Steve makes really good points about the port. You got to have something or a reason to go there, right? And Port Clarence, for one, is a natural deep water port where some of the larger ships could actually go in refuge. And so I think that one has potential to be important for us, because it's, we have ADAC and then we have Port Clarence, or the two deep waters. And then Steve and Nils' follow-up comments, I really appreciated and liked what they were saying, because, they highlight how it's not necessarily the infrastructure, it's the economy. That's very true. However, where I come from, you don't have the economy until you have the infrastructure. And it's small scale for like Unalakleet with a runway that hauls out fish, or Alaska with a port that could haul out fish. And that digs into what do we look like in 2050? And this map really hits me as a map of where we have been and given history, right? What we're kind of missing is the opportunity to where we could go, and infrastructure is what will let us get there. Missing from the map to me is the fiber systems. Yeah, not necessarily state infrastructure, but the connectivity of fiber, the connectivity of water and sewer systems allows livability, and we're missing that opportunity. We're kind of a one-trick pony here with all efforts to oil and gas, a little bit to mining, and a little bit to Bristol Bay. We're missing all the opportunity that this current crisis brought us. Everybody's in tech is moving to Boise or Texas. We don't have the basic infrastructure to capitalize on a growing population. If the Knik Arm Bridge was there, yeah, I see that more as an opportunity for freight transportation, even though the rail already happens there. But for the side that is being trucked, you could kind of bypass the population center and the impacts that Fairbanks is going to see with Eielson and the mine up there. You could work your way around that. So to me, that has possibility, that particular project. If we had good internet, fiber connectivity throughout the state, and the ability to provide housing, or the ability for there to be enough houses, then we have the opportunity to capitalize on a growing population of a new generation. But we're sort of stuck in the way we have done business. So hopefully we could kind of move that direction. But I agree with Steve on his comments, but I also want to adjust from my position that we need that basic infrastructure in order to provide the economy. So, thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
Great.
So
just a real quick follow-up on that is part of our scenario planning and data. So glad you brought all of that up, because we are actually mapping all of that to understand where there is good cell coverage, where there is good broadband coverage. And so we are starting to map some of those livability pieces to understand how technology can spread and where people might live or might not live. So all of that will come into play as we start to develop these scenarios more comprehensively. So great comments, thank you. And then quickly, Holly, I'm seeing a lot of comments about climate change. We're also, to the extent that the data is available, we're mapping coastal erosion, we're mapping permafrost melting. What else are we mapping? Flooding. So we're starting to capture all of that too. So all of this will kind of get layered, and certain parts of the state will light up under the different scenarios to help us understand demand changes. So there's many pieces to this puzzle.
Okay, last comment, Steve, and then we're going to move on to the next activity. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. No, I just wanted to suggest, because at the end of the day, this is a big policy conversation in the hopes of putting a plan together. But I don't think, I think we need to figure out, how do we articulate in this plan that ports are a big part of the state's transportation system, and they own zero, which means there's some kind of level of cooperation or dialogue or what have you with ports that are for the most part municipally owned, that state DOT has to dive into and be willing to do, whether they like it or not. Because you can't put together a long-range transportation plan in a state that, for all intents and purposes, is an island, without involving the port infrastructure that exists now and understanding what its needs are to connect to the transportation system, and learn enough about them so you can appreciate the challenges that we all have.
Okay. All right. With that, if you're comfortable, Wendy, I'm going to move on to the next. You good? Okay. Thank you for going through that. That was good. So now, also, if you didn't get to speak, we have everything that you entered in the chat, and that was good participation. So thank you. Okay, so now I want to move you back to the 3 scenarios we've talked about a little bit. Let's start thinking about them in more detail and more depth. Okay. Powering down, cruising, and full speed ahead. And, whatever nuanced version of that might mean to you. Okay. So I want to start to get you thinking and maybe talking about, what does transportation look like in 2050 under each one of these scenarios. Okay. And I'm going to read some questions to get you going. And the map is there just kind of for reference, to have something in front of you. Okay. So for each scenario, how does low growth, no growth, so powering down, cruising, and full speed ahead, where are people living? And maybe think about this from your own perspective. Where are people living? How are they moving around the state? How would transportation or travel patterns be different or change? Under each scenario, how might goods move around the state, whether low, medium, or high growth? Ability to plan for and respond to climate change. How does connectivity between communities change? How are we able to implement new technologies? What is our financial stability for each transportation mode based on each scenario? Okay, so I'm going to stop there. These questions were listed in your packet that we sent out, so you can refer to those as we're talking. So this is intended to be a discussion, right? So maybe somebody has an initial idea, they just want to dive in. I know you're thinking about what these scenarios might mean for you personally. Who wants to start? I know it's hard.
I'll throw out maybe just a little bit of a prime the pump question. So we were
Love
just
it.
talking about how the tourism economy might be an important part of that economic future. So where would the people be who live in Alaska? How would that affect, kind of run through those questions that Holly just mentioned, thinking of a particular economic driver to help answer that question. And I'd love to hear how tourism would play out.
Let's go to Cole first.
Yeah, so actually that's kind of where my mind goes. I'm here representing a bit more of the federal lands transportation, and my thought goes to, in thinking about each of those, sorry, I have all three documents up for the thing. So thinking about slowing down, slow economy, declining population, think about the impact on gateway communities, especially in Alaska, as they connect with, say, certainly the National Park Service, but also Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, and some of those others. So the gateway communities, Golconda, Alaska, we'll pick that as a good example. I have a project there that connects obviously to Wrangell, St. Elias. And so the movement between into that community and then onto the Park Service, obviously parkland would obviously change quite a bit. In a slowdown economy, there'd be less, I think, economic activity for Golconda. Staying the same about where we are now, and then increasing, then you're adding a lot more traffic, a lot more wear and tear on the system, not just on the state system, but also tribal lands, and then connecting to the National Park Service lands. So you just think about that increased movement, increased economic activity, and the increased wear and tear, and how that might impact it. That's about all I had.
Okay. Thanks, Cole. I might have a follow-up unless anyone else wants to dive in. Go ahead, Nils.
I am working on being more shy, so I'm sorry. So I'll just throw some stuff out and see where it lands. I think, I mean, cruising in a lot of ways for me looks like kind of this current status quo we talked about, kind of up and down. It means kind of the slow erosion of all the things that we depend on. It means that there's less. We're doing less with less, basically, is what cruising looks like to me right now. We're not able to keep up with inflation. We're not able to increase our GDP. We see a slow erosion of population and GDP, and kind of, wither in some ways, and probably find some stability around hub communities, anchor institutions, anchor economic activity, gateway communities. They've all got kind of access points to an economy that would keep, most communities going. So that's what cruising looks like to me. Powering down in a lot of ways means that, we're not able to meet we're not only able to meet current needs, we're really start choosing to address future needs. Powering down to me looks like closing 30% of our local governments, where city operations aren't able to sustain themselves. They don't have that partnership with the state. They're not able to maintain DOT airports. They're not able to plow roads. They're not able to keep utilities operating. A lot of those functions transfer to tribal governments, maybe, and or populations move outside of traditional communities, beyond hub communities, and maybe outside the state. So it's really a collapse in a lot of ways of the Alaska economy and population. That feels really bad when I say it, but I don't know that it's not implausible if we don't make some of the decisions we need to, and if we don't have strong support from a federal government that right now, there's indication that they are very supportive and are making those investments. So powering down is very scary for me in a lot of ways, and it definitely impacts the transportation decisions that we've got in front of us. And it's not going to be any one of those single projects that save us. There's no silver bullet to powering down. It's really a system-wide failure, structural failure that we should be concerned about. I do like the idea of full speed ahead. It means that we're doing more with more on all counts, that we require more of Alaskans. We require as much and more of the state as we currently see. and we've got a strong federal partnership. It means that local governments have more ability to take more on, including more responsibilities for things like transportation. There's more opportunities for partnerships between local governments and the state and the federal government, including through project management and transportation development. And then it's a slew of economic activity that that actually increase over time, that it's not just military expansion or a mine or fisheries or tourism, that all of these things are actively increasing in these coming decades, and we're able to capture that effectively at the state and local level to make the investments necessary to really be at full speed ahead.
Okay, so
that's what I think.
So I'm going to go back to Aaron's first question. What does fiscal responsibility look like under each of these scenarios? Who's paying for what?
For powering down, nobody's paying for anything. We're unwilling to tax ourselves. We draw down from the permanent fund or whatever. Federal government's not going to sustain its investment. Cruising in some ways means some of the same, where we make limited choices based on political feasibility. Full speed ahead is really a path that's most plausible under greater fiscal responsibility, which means revenues that flow into the state and are invested back into communities, and communities have that same ability through their tax base to make similar investments.
So I kind of want to maybe bring up something that Kim, you asked us, I think, in an email, and it relates to the growth of the Mat-Su, right? So maybe in the scenario where the state of Alaska as a whole might be in a cruising scenario, there might be other places in the state that are in more of a growth mode, like where you have experienced population increase, or maybe hub communities are experiencing a population increase. So how would you think about these? So if the statewide scenario was cruising or powering down, and maybe you were experiencing a little growth, what do you think that means for you? I don't know. I just want to throw it out there because I know it's something that's on your mind.
I guess I don't know. Like some of the conversations we're having here at the Mat-Su Borough, with the potential MPO coming online and our ability to do a better job with transportation planning and directing funds to infrastructure, maybe outside of what the state is already doing, we're starting to talk about water and sewer infrastructure and what would that change in the Mat-Su related to population and population density if we could provide, if the cities of Wasilla and Palmer merged with the borough to provide that infrastructure. How would that help our population? How could we better focus on public transit and making it possible for not everyone to have a car to get to point A to point B? But I feel a little out of my comfort zone trying to think about the statewide issues and Mat-Su. So I don't know how else to answer your question other than we're thinking about these issues in the absence of lots of state funding to help us build more roads. What are we going to do for ourselves? Like, how are we going to figure this out? I guess that's all I can say.
Yeah, so in an absence of state funding, more local resources are at the table. Yeah. Okay.
So Holly, let me ask this question, and I'll take the lumps. So if the state, this goes a little bit back to what Steve was saying earlier. So if the state reaches 1 million people under full speed ahead, do you see the transportation system drastically changing? Flip side, if the state falls, I don't know, below where we are today, do you see the transportation system drastically changing?
Okay. Steve, do you have an answer to that?
Well, I've got a very selfish answer to that because we've actually, back of the envelope, done some of that. And for the population to grow from 750,000 people to 1 million people is of no consequence to us. You know, we have a facility that today operates at 40% capacity.
Okay.
There's plenty of room for growth without having to add another square foot of real estate to make that happen. You know, our issues are age and corrosion and those kinds of things. But from a support to commerce perspective, the way the port industry thinks anyway is until you have a facility that is operating at 70% capacity or greater, you've got sufficient infrastructure to do what it is you have to do. So our challenge is not adding more port, and the state's challenge isn't even adding more port. It's we just add more port calls because we have the space and the time to make that happen. So, you know, we could stand to see the state population quadruple or greater before there's a problem with the infrastructure being able to, you know, for our infrastructure to be able to support that.
What about outside your door, Steve?
Well, you know, outside our door is a problem now. You know, there's only one way in and one way out of this place, and a bridge that a good stiff wind on a really bad day could probably blow over. I mean, that, you know, that part of the, you know, that the road infrastructure is it's ill suited for the amount of volume that we have today, and everybody knows that. And there's lots of you know, there's lots of road projects and at-grade crossing challenges and all that everybody is painfully aware of and is going to try to chip away at over time. And that's important, and that has to happen. I mean, you know, our challenge is we got to dock it's old. Let us worry about that. And the state's already told us they could care less. So we'll take care of that. But getting things in and out of here efficiently is I think where, you know, is going to be an important part of what this plan suggests, gets considered and gets looked at. And but from a, you know, from a port need, from our point of view, is we've got a long way to go before we don't have enough port.
So what about, thanks, Steve. What about if the population grows to 1 million? We started talking about roads a little bit. What about any other modes? Any other thinking on any other modes? What happens if the population grows? What does the transportation system look like?
Do you think population will generally stay in the same area that it is now? We've got growth kind of in the Northwest Arctic Borough. We've got actually growth around the Bethel area, Fairbanks, Mat-Su. And then, of course, you know, people still migrate to Anchorage, Juneau, the bigger cities. In 50 years, do we think that it's going to be that same general pattern? Do you see a huge upset if we all have personal airplanes?
I don't see chicken becoming the up and coming bedroom community to anywhere.
Okay, so maybe I'll move us to the question about investment priorities for each scenario. Right? Are you ready to go there, Wendy? I'm gonna go. So again, each scenario, powering down, cruising, full speed ahead. What and where are investment priorities for the state? For DOT, let's keep it there. Capital improvements, expansion, safety, operations, maintenance. So how do the investment priorities change based on each scenario? Or how would you, if you were in charge of DOT? Cole, we'll go to you.
Well, I mean, partly I'm speaking from my past state DOT perspective, but the further you go towards the powering down end of the spectrum, the more you emphasize, the more purely maintenance takes up a larger proportion of your planning and your funding. So maintaining the system that you have, and possibly getting into a bit more of system triage. What portions of the road do you downgrade, or you move from paved to gravel or something like that? So basically triaging the system down to it's a more manageable size. Cruising, again, you're into that same area of maintenance and rehabilitation. So not necessarily replacing or expanding, but rehabilitating bridges, things like that. Then full speed ahead that's when you're getting into much more of your capital investment and truly changing the system. So that's generally the way I see it.
Anyone else?
General concurrence with that, Adam?
Yes, thank you. I guess I would just add, from my perspective, and again, coming from the federal aid side or on the state side, using federal funds in the state, we are a state that is largely funded through federal highways for the surface transportation work that we do. Less familiar on the aviation side there. And so we don't have a great amount of flexibility with our current and historic funding the way we have done our transportation programming. It is largely reliant on what we are getting from the federal government here. And so that's just something to keep in mind, that while we would like to think we have some agency in the flexibility in what projects we choose and how we go about the transportation, a lot of actually what we are going to be doing will be driven by what's happening in Washington, D.C. Unless we have an internal state revenue source, more local revenue sources, where we have funds that provide additional flexibility for us and to pursue different projects, not fully reliant on what's coming from the federal government.
Anyone else?
Please. Go ahead, the other person.
Go ahead.
This is Clarence Daniel, out in AVCP for Bethel. With growth and everything, especially I think our area would be considered isolated. So like with our projects out here, I would like to see DOT, working more hand in hand with the tribal transportation program groups, with the tribes that run their tribal transportation programs. Something that I see, here at AVCP, our tribal transportation program has, I think we've done about 12 construction projects since 2010 in the villages. In the same time, I've seen only one done by DOT. And as I've been trying to work with DOT, one of the biggest obstacles I see is we have to use a contractor, and the contractor usually brings 95% of their own workers into the region. So there's no economic benefit to the region. There's only a benefit of the completed project. If we can work with some of the regulations to allow for more local hire. What we found is, I heard Stephen saying there's no skilled labor. When we started out, we found the skilled labor lacked, so we went out and we invested in our own. We grew our own skilled labor with Utlik Narvet, the local tribal vocational center here. And we produced our own certified welders. We produced our own operators so that we didn't have to rely on a contractor coming in with their own employees. And we produced the same projects that that any contractor would produce. And I think if a lot hand in hand work with the tribes and the tribal transportation program, there's a lot of money coming down from FHWA to tribes with tribal transportation, and if we want more infrastructure development in isolated areas, we really need to work on those partnerships and working more together instead of having you know, restrictions to make it hard to work with each other.
Thank you so much, Clarence. Okay, I think there was one person that. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was Lee. Yeah, and I'm glad Clarence went before me. That was awesome to hear the tribal view, and how regulation could, not necessarily regulation itself, but infrastructure creates economy in those communities and allows for people to stay where they want to stay within the state. You know, that's a different conversation in politics we don't have to get into today. But your question really, to me, is like, hey, I don't want to be the commissioner, first off, but Ryan's got a good job ahead of him. But if I were commenting from that position right now, I would say we're not cruising, we're not powering down. We have all this infrastructure funding available to the state, coming available to the state, and we need to be full steam ahead and really charging the deputies by mode and each region to create a comprehensive list of capital investments, maintenance and operations, deferred maintenance, and by mode, and really push it hard to find the gray. How do we maybe make some of this deferred stuff capital at this moment? How do we because somebody commented on airports, right? We build an airport, we have grant assurances that we have to maintain it for 20 years, but because of the location and the remoteness, we have all this deferred maintenance that just doesn't happen because we don't have the infrastructure assets to be able to maintain, right? So we come in 10 years, we're back ready for capital because we couldn't M&O. So I think that right now it's full steam ahead. Build those lists, find the gray, work with every department in the federal government to ensure that we could capitalize every single available dollar. I mean, different spelling, right? Capitalize. How do we get every single dollar and make sure it's spent in Alaska to build, rebuild, and maintain our infrastructure, zero out our deferred maintenance, zero out our debts on maintenance and operations, and invest in capital areas where we can by mode in our current infrastructure, because this stuff was built a long time ago, most of it, some of it's maintained, but this basic infrastructure that we currently have, we have to keep it. There's some areas, you know, that might be beneficial to use a couple of the B dollars, right, to make it happen, so we could create further infrastructure in terms of other departments within the state of Alaska. The DOT provides that basic infrastructure, and they could go maintain and serve through movement of goods and services and people, the ability for those departments to build up. So right now it's extremely important. If we don't do that now, we're too far behind to be a healthy 2050 with the upper hand.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to stop the discussion here. Wendy, I'm going to let you maybe say some final words, and then I'll talk about where we'll go next.
First of all, I think this is the best meeting we've had. I've loved the conversation. I love the dialogue. I love the back and forth and the challenging and thinking outside the box. This is incredibly helpful to the project team to come up with some plausible futures. Many of you are the local experts, and that really helps us have some credibility when we come forward with these scenarios. And I think it's, affirmed some of the things our team was thinking. You've shaken up a couple of our ideas. And so we've got some really good marching orders moving forward. So our next step is we're really going to use this feedback to inform the scenarios. The next figures that you'll see will be very illustrative. You won't see projects, you'll see areas of the state heated up. and all of your input and all of the data we have will kind of heat them up under the different high, medium, low scenarios, if you will. And we'll be able to talk about those and the assumptions we used. So from those, we'll start to craft those policies, and you will see policies that are related to safety, to the port, to freight, to ferries, to trains. So how all of that interconnectedness works. So we're going to look ways to maximize the opportunities, minimize the risks. And then we're launching a public outreach event the last week of January, just in a couple of weeks. And we're going to kind of ask them some of these same questions. You know, how would you invest if we had all the money in the world and no limitations? And how would you invest if things were not quite so rosy? So I think, you know, we have a list of survey questions for them. Based on this conversation, I plan on adjusting some of them. I think we have like one port question. We have a couple of freight questions. We've got some aviation. We try to hit even the ferries, not even the ferries. I didn't mean to dismiss the ferries. We have something for each mode. But I think we want to be a little bit more specific on some of those based on this conversation. So we'll be refining those questions. So again, thank you so much. This was a really powerful and wonderful conversation, and I think I have nothing else to add.
Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. We'll be in touch with the next steps when it's time to see the exciting results. All right, have a great afternoon.
Thanks. Bye.